Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Bridges, thank you for being here today. Our staff went from this committee, actually visited down at in Vicksburg at the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center. And they saw firsthand a lot of the research that you're doing. So thank you for hosting them there. So I guess what I would like to ask is, since you've begun in the Corps' begun in this endeavor, what gaps are you still identifying that you might be able to be working on for the future for the next 10 to 20 years? Are you able to identify those for the long-term longevity of such projects?
Thank you for the question, Senator. There are gaps that are related to technical issues that we have with these kinds of projects. As I mentioned, understanding fundamentally how they produce benefits, so going to those projects and measuring them. But there are also gaps in respect to communicating about projects across a large enterprise like the Corps of Engineers, and that's one of the points of emphasis we've made within the Engineering with Nature initiative, is to share information more broadly across the Corps of Engineers and with our partners and stakeholders about good practice examples that are incorporating natural systems into engineering projects. There's always going to be a need, for example, for technical guidance on how to plan, how to design, how to operate projects that include this combination of the natural and the engineered. We've been leading an effort. Engineering with Nature has been leading an international effort for the last 5 years to develop technical guidelines on the use of natural and nature-based features for flood risk management, with an international consortium that includes the Environment Agency in England, as well as the Rijkswaterstaat in the Netherlands, more than 75 organizations and 170 contributors around the globe, drawing together practice and experience implementing these kinds of solutions. And we will be publishing this 1,000-page technical guide later this summer and complementing it with a shorter 40-page version to provide people an introduction to what this kind of practice looks like. And so we're working to fill gaps and to document progress widely across our organization and others, so that we can, in fact, implement more projects of this nature in the future consistent with sound practice.
When using natural or nature-based infrastructure, what's the maintenance and longevity of that project as compared to what you might think of as a more traditional type of infrastructure?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Wetlands have existed for millennia,
right?
So they have a long
yeah.
Yes, and so when we approach the design of these systems, these nature-based systems, we want to follow kind of Mother Nature's lead, if you will, so that these projects, these features within the projects can be sustained over time. Maintenance of projects over decades, of course, is an area of uncertainty for conventional as well as it is for nature-based, and something that we look forward to gaining more experience on. We have recently gone back to some decades-old projects where we have used, for example, beneficially sediment dredged from projects and built islands and wetlands in the 1970s. We've gone back to those projects recently to look at, well, how do those projects perform? And in fact, they performed quite well, so that we can learn from that in future efforts to design projects to provide the services that we're looking for through Engineering with Nature.
Right. I mean, obviously, I'm on appropriations as well, and obviously, when you think about the massive investments that the Corps makes, and the massive structures that are built, or the massive problems that they're addressing, anything that can last longer and be more cost effective is always at the top of the list. And maybe some of these solutions, while they might be more expensive on the front end, on the back end, they might end up actually being cost saving and have a lot of other external benefits. So I kind of went out on a limb there and said, in West Virginia, we have a lot of rivers and we have a lot of flash floods. Most of the pictures that you showed were coastline pictures. Do you find that this type of solution works better on a coast or is more effective than, say, on riverbanks and more rapid flow water, which is what we experience in my state with the mountainous terrain?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Senator. I think there are great examples of practice across the full spectrum of the landscapes we have in the United States. And the atlases are intended to expose, and there are many inland, riverine, small rivers and streams, as well as more mountainous examples, including in places like Scotland, which has very steep terrain. And they're working across their landscape to implement and to intervene in the system to slow down water and spread water out so that it doesn't pile up on communities in the form of floods. I was recently made aware of an example from the city of Huntington in West Virginia, where the city itself is experiencing repeated flooding due to high rainfall events, and the city is itself investing in nature-based solutions to relieve its overwhelmed stormwater management system. So with Engineering with Nature, what we're talking about is looking across the entire landscape to find ways in which we can implement solutions like that to relieve the burden from the conventional infrastructure by spreading it out and slowing it down. So in the case of Scotland and England, they're investing in reforestation in cases, or using features like what they call leaky dams, hundreds of these, in which they're putting these temporary wooden structures in place to be able to slow the water down, to keep it from piling up on villages downstream within the watershed. So it's a distributed approach in places that have topography like West Virginia, as opposed to flatter terrain, say in the state of Oklahoma or Kansas or Missouri, where these kinds of features in the form of levee setbacks and other applications have been used by the Corps and other agencies to incorporate natural floodplains into flood risk design.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Ms. Effner, I want to talk about partnerships between the Corps and non-federal sponsors. You obviously, that was the core crux of your testimony. I think I heard that you and maybe Mr. Johnson had some concerns about different agencies playing into these projects, and is the right hand talking to the left hand? And can you expound on that a little bit and give me an example of other agencies that are working with the Corps and the non-federal sponsors to get these kinds of projects off the ground?
Thank you, Senator, for your question, and I'm happy to respond. And I may defer to Mr. Johnson for more specific examples. At least from our members, from what we understand, we do hear some challenges with the Army Corps of Engineers working with other federal agencies, specifically in levee safety, per se, with the FEMA. We highlighted an example with Public Law 8499 earlier, but there are other examples on how does flood risk management fit in with the overall issue within levee safety. So our point has always been that it's our non-federal sponsors who are on the ground paying for these projects, and they are in touch with the local communities. They know what's best for the program, so we would really encourage federal agencies to work within that confine.
Mr. Johnson, did you want to make a comment on that?
I just might add one. In California, especially, we are very cognizant of impacts on the habitat, and so when sometimes some of the Corps directives where they want us to remove some of the vegetation that are on or near the levees, that has created some issues with some of the other federal agencies, such as Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Services. So those can complicate projects when they kind of are at odds on the purposes at a federal level.
Mr. Chasson, I don't know if I said that right, but do you have experience with conflicting federal agencies and working on the Corps projects with your project?
I could talk for 3 hours about that, but what I can tell you is, yes, there are. What happens a lot of times, especially when you're trying to get a permit to do some work in a coastal area, there's conflicting, and I talked about silos. Everybody has their own mission, and a lot of times all those missions conflict. So it's hard as a local sponsor to try to tap dance around all of those different, instead of looking at what the main mission of the project is and where we're trying to go, and trying to mold that together to make something that's actually doable, because it's both environmentally and economically beneficial.
Is your port primarily serve as a land base for offshore oil and gas support service companies? Is that the main function?
Yes, it does. We like to call it offshore energy these days.
That's good. Well, this is an interesting question, I think, for this, because the Biden administration's fiscal year 2020 budget request includes language stating that one of the objectives considered in developing the request was, quote, not funding work that directly subsidizes fossil fuels, including work that lowers the cost of production, lowers the cost of consumption, or raises the revenues retained by producers of fossil fuels. Would that cause you a problem that you're going to be, because of the function that your port is there for and at main function, servicing the oil industry, you're going to get knocked down in your ability to be able to get help?
Yes, it would, and it would also hinder our ability to look at offshore wind and other sources of energy offshore. As an offshore oil and gas services port currently, it's our customers, it's the technology that exists in offshore oil and gas that's actually helping to create the offshore wind farms in the Northeast. And so that type of ruling or that regulation would hinder us from even embarking on further capabilities to service the offshore wind market, and we're going to continue to try to pursue that.
Right, and I might add, too, if the substance of the hearing that is nature-based and natural infrastructure, if you're hemmed up from being able to access the expertise and the funding that goes along with that as a goal of being more environmentally friendly or compatible, you're really at cross purposes, I think, from what this regulation would say.
That is correct.
Yeah, okay. While I'm waiting for the chairman to take his seat so I can go vote, I'm going to ask Ms. Effner again, how, when putting projects together, and I know a lot of funding comes from non-federal partners, how important is the research and development that Dr. Bridges talked about, and how do you coordinate that with your non-federal partners, with your membership?
Thank you for that question, Senator. You know, that's a difficult question to answer, because what we have found from talking with our members is that natural-based features, the challenges differ across the nation. You know, the challenge is this has been around for years, nature-based features, and we're still learning a lot about them. One of the examples that we highlighted in the testimony on Orange County, California, they had two very similar projects. One worked, one did not. And what will work in, say, California with Mr. Johnson may not work in the Gulf Coast. And that's still research that's happening. And it's hopefully through these projects as we move forward that we'll be able to glean more details and share them with each other, because it's all about collaboration and becoming a win-win for us all in the end.
Yeah, and I would imagine Dr. Bridges talked about the atlas that's being created. I'm sure that will be very helpful to projects all across the country. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I will go make my vote.
There you go.